So first up we have Sister Elizabeth Davis, who's on the board of directors of the Gathering Place, and she'll be talking about reimagining a healthcare system good enough for all of us. Sister Elizabeth.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would want to echo Dr. Gammon's comments early this morning, how privileged we are to live on the land which the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit first called home. Now, there's only one thing worse than being the second last speaker of the day. That's being the last speaker of the day. And I'm well aware that everything I'm going to say has been said probably in one way or another, but not in my way. And my first words of my title are important. I am not interested anymore in simply tinkering with our present system. I think we have to create a new system, that we have to reimagine a system that is truly good enough for all of us. So fixing one little piece here or one little piece there will no longer work. There are times when an incremental approach is the wisest and best approach. This is not the time. My perspective is very clear. I come out of the tertiary care system, which I was part of for a number of years, and stayed part of far too long, as you can tell by the color of hair. But I have another perspective today that comes from my connection with two other health-related organizations in this city. St. Patrick's Mercy Home, which is a long-term care facility, and the Gathering Place. So you're going to hear in my comments echoes of those aspects of the system. Now, it's interesting that Mark and I are the last speakers, and I suppose we're the ordinary citizens, but you'd be stretched to call me an ordinary citizen simply because I've been tainted a bit by the systems that I've been part of. But this is my bottom line. In Canada, we use the word equity and then go on to something else. If we don't have a health system that's good enough for all of us, it's not good enough. Today, we do not have a health system that is good enough for all of us. But nobody today said, what is our definition of human health? The definition of human health that created our present system is the absence of illness or injury. We are slowly getting into the 1948 definition, a state of complete physical, mental, spiritual, and social well-being. Slowly getting into that. We're nowhere near the 1986 definition created by the World Health Organization, that we're no longer talking about the absence of illness or injury. We're talking about a resource for everyday life. We're talking about physical capacities, social and personal resources. And we're certainly nowhere near the Australian Aboriginal definition, which is the well-being of the individual as well as the social, emotional, spiritual, and cultural well-being of the whole community. So we blithely pass over what we mean by human health, but we have to watch that because that's one of, as Steve Tomlin would keep saying to me, you create the knowledge by the language you're using. And the language we're using is still the absence of illness or injury, I'm afraid. Now, I do believe in my lifetime we've had three major transformations in healthcare. The first was Medicare. The first act of 57, then we had the actual Medical Care Act of 66, and then finally the Canada Health Act, which we operate under today. 1984 is a while ago. It was the first year I came into healthcare leadership, but it has been a while ago. Then in 74 and again in 86, we were leaders in the world in articulating social determinants of health, population health, that we needed to build a health system around this. We were leaders in articulating it, not in living into it. And then the third one that I was too much part of, many in this room would say, was the regionalization of healthcare in the early 90s in this country. Each one of those three big moments changed the way we look at healthcare delivery. I believe we're due for a fourth change 1990s is too long ago for a transformation. Now, I think our health system is really good in so many ways. I was privileged to work in it for quite some time. Certainly, we have universal health care, which not every country in the world has. We have supremely good acute care and tertiary care, and are inching into good primary care. Good community health care developing in pieces and bits around the country. We have incredibly competent, dedicated health professionals and health workers. We have good, strong unions that see beyond simply advocating for the individual members. We have good in this country, really good professional formation and oversight. I believe regionalization, for all its flaws, was the right direction. And now our research is much improved in my lifetime, beyond clinical to genetics and health policy. So we have much to be proud of in our country's health system, much to be proud of in a health system that's replicated here in this province. However, we have major, major flaws. The people in the country and the people in this province that our health system fails are older people, poor people, mentally ill people, Indigenous people, and refugees and immigrants. We are abysmal in responding to the health and healthcare needs of these groups of people. I won't speak much to the mentally ill response because Mark will be doing that in his last session. I will say that we've done well to begin to diminish the stigma around mental illness. I will also say that the President of the United States is putting that backwards by centuries in terms of what he's doing by blaming the deaths in the schools on mental illness. And sadly, in our own province, I have been watching the news for a couple of weeks that has given undue coverage to a mentally ill woman who was involved in a criminal case. And that kind of coverage only underlies what President Trump is trying to do in the United States. And I hope that doesn't set that whole mental illness advocacy that we have been so passionate about, I hope it doesn't set it back any further. So, I also believe that those flaws, these failings that I just mentioned, are not failings of the healthcare system. They're failings of our society. We create the healthcare system. We shape the healthcare system. We are the problem. And a healthcare system alone cannot fix itself. It's an instrument of the society, an instrument of the society. Let's look at old people. This is an actual photograph from England. Now, there are elderly crossings and there's a cemetery sign. They came together. Now, most of us think that way, though, about elderly people. We even use the phrase, the elderly, to identify a whole group of people by one characteristic, their age. Now, I'm one of the elderly. Actually, there are a couple of us on the panel I suspect are elderly, given that 65 is the age. I'm not looking at Pat Parfrey, but... So I'm an old woman. And if I'm somewhere where somebody doesn't know me, they try to treat me like an old woman. And I'm not the only one of my age and older who's treated that way. In 2002, on the World Forum Assembly on Aging, one of the people there said, in the 20th century, old age was but a footnote. In the 21st century, however, it will become the main theme. So let's look at some of the world statistics. For the first time in history, most people can live to be over 60. The number of people age 60 are expected to rise from 740 billion today to 740 million, to 1 billion by 2020. By 2050, more than 20% of the world's population will be over 60. By 2050, For the first time in human history, more persons will be over 60 than children. Now, those last two statistics are true for Canada today. We don't have to wait till 2050. Women, there are more women. We're just stronger and more durable. So we outnumber men over the age of 60 and quite significantly over the age of 80. But a longer life does not necessarily mean a longer quality of life. And we know from the existing evidence that older people are not experiencing better health than previous generations. They just have chronic illness longer. We also know, not unexpectedly, that those who have experienced disadvantage across their lifetime are at a higher risk of poor health when they get older. It doesn't require genius to figure that out. We've talked about life expectancy. In 2021, our population in this province over 65 will be 22.5%. 27% 5 years later, and you saw the statistics this morning, by 2038 it will be 34%. So it's not an insignificant population. So why are we concerned? Well, the challenges facing older people today, simplistically put here obviously, but the first and the dominant one is ageism. The ageism in our society is rampant. I suspect part of it is a denial that we don't want to think that we're going to become older. If we had the amount of money spent on hair dye in Canada, we would never need to worry about funding the health system in Newfoundland. And creams. So we as a society want to deny our aging, and in so doing, we turn on people who we see as aging. It's a fascinating human response. There are many older people who are poor. And with poor goes things like homelessness, malnutrition, and so on. The extent of violence and abuse of older people is staggering. Those of you in this room who are clinicians who've worked in emergency rooms, you know this better than I do. The amount of violence and abuse of older people, just saying that sentence out loud. Our cities are not designed for older people. Certainly this city is not. Our communities are not, but sadly, neither is our health systems. The health systems in this province are ageist. As a leader, one of my responsibilities in our congregation revolves around the health care for our sisters, and most of our sisters are older women. I have been appalled at the ageism they have experienced in hospitals in this city. I have been appalled by it. Not to say what my experience is out of St. Patrick's Mercy Home and their experience of their residents who go to hospitals. It's appalling. An interesting set of ads. Unfortunately, that's far more common than you would think. So what is healthy aging? It's not something new that Canada has developed or thinking about. That definition from 1986 from the World Health Organization was trying to get us to see this, and we refused to see it. Now the World Health Organization is giving us some good language around what healthy aging might mean. But can you imagine a healthcare system which relies on functional abilities, not absence of illness or injury, functional abilities, that brings together intrinsic capacities that the person has with the environmental factors around them, environment written quite large in terms of all of the elements of the environment. Because if you can't imagine a health system out of that definition, we don't have the right health system yet. And we have in this room leaders in the health system. So if you can't imagine what it looks like, we're in big trouble. The first strategies, by the way, you can tell if it's a Canadian or an American-speaking reading versus a European. We spell aging without an E. They spell it with an E. We as a society have to address ageism. We have to find ways to stop the stereotyping and the abuse that comes with that stereotyping in our society. We need to promote wellness across elder-friendly communities. We have to give stronger support for aging in place. One group within our society for whom ageism is a significant problem is our Indigenous population. We have to address elder abuse. All of that is in the society at large. Then within the health system itself, we finally have to align our health system to the needs of older people. It's useless to say those older people are shocking. They're using up so much a percentage of all our healthcare resources. I once was behind one of the ministers of health on a panel, and he said we should respect older people because of all the good they have done for us. And I stood up and said, we should respect older people because they're people. Whether they were nice people and did something for me or were a problem for me is not why we respect people. Do you ever realize what we do as a society? We treat children as pre-adults, and we treat older people as post-adults. And that's so ingrained in our society that we can't get it out of us. And it's ingrained in every social institution that we create. We also have, we heard all day today about creating sustainable systems for long-term care, addressing medication use. I would add caring for caregivers who are also often elderly people themselves, ensuring a workforce that's well educated in care for older people, and then, as we heard over and over again, improving the monitoring and research measurement for healthy aging. Now, Newfoundland Labrador has a healthy aging policy framework. I doubt there's 2 people in this room know about it except the people who were paid to create it. Like, it's gone nowhere. It has all the right elements in it, but it's not making one iota of difference in how I'm treated when I go into, well, I'd be treated at St. Clair's Emergency, well, probably. I hope. But a woman my age who's not me, how she's treated at St. Clair's Emergency is not yet influenced by that policy framework in any way, shape, or form. The second group of people who are badly treated by our health system are poor people. I wish that image you're seeing on the screen was a very rare image from some underdeveloped country. It's not. You're probably very familiar with the champagne glass of world poverty. 20% of the people in the world own 83% of the wealth in the world. And a champagne glass is a wonderful, iconic image, isn't it? Now, every one of us in this room is in that top 20%, by the way. But this is more startling. In 2016, Oxfam brought out some figures. They said 62 people own the same wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people in the world. And that wealth has increased by 542 billion for those 62 individuals since 2010. At the same time, for the 3.4 billion people, they lost $1 trillion. So people said, Oxfam, you're one of those feel-good organizations, your research is not up to par. So they brought in independent researchers, and they were right. Oxfam was wrong. 8 men in the world own the same amount of money as 3.6 billion people. 8 men. You probably can name 3 or 4 of them. 1 in 10 people on this earth survive on less than $2 a day. 7 out of 10 people on this earth live in a country that has seen a rise in inequality in the last 20 years, and we're in that group. And good news for the women in the group, it's only going to take 170 years for us to be paid the same as men for the same work. Now, I wish I could say that's those poor countries. That's not true for Canada. There are 5 million people in Canada who are poor. 5 million. Not is that only true, but like that Oxfam study showed, that gap is widening, not narrowing it. By the mid-60s in Canada, we had the narrowest gap between the rich and the poor on earth. And then it started to widen, and it's been widening ever since. Between 1980 and 2005, the average earnings among the least wealthy Canadians fell by 20%. And it's obvious what the health implications are. And you know what's kind of really, really painful? 1 in 5 immigrant families who came to this country for a better life lives in poverty. Who's most likely to be poor? People with disabilities, mental or physical, homeless people, Indigenous people. Almost a third of shelter users across the country are Indigenous people. Older people who are living alone. And you know, if you're, neither one of you would be, but if you're among the 2 million people receiving GIS with your OAS, you're getting $17,000 a year, which is below the poverty line. Let's put more face on that. 36% of First Nations women who live off the reserve are poor. 23% of Métis and Inuit women are poor. Visible minorities, women with disabilities, look at those numbers. Children in lone parent families led by a female. Children with disabilities. 50% of status First Nations children live in poverty. And look at our wonderful record. We are 17th in the world of the status of child well-being taken within rich countries. 17th in the world. And our health and safety actually mark us at 27th in the world. This is appalling. Homelessness, the recent study that you all heard played last year, 3 million Canadian households, and that's understated, by the way, are precariously housed. At any one time, 235,000 people are experiencing homelessness. Any one night, there are 35,000 people in Canada without a home to sleep in. Youth make up 20% of that, so look at their future. One of the saddest images you will ever see is a young mother with her child, her newborn baby, going to the gathering place for her lunch. What hope has she got, and what hope has her child got? 4 million people in Canada are experiencing food insecurity. 4 million. 1 in 8 Canadian households struggle to put food on the table, and you know some of those people. Our Indigenous people, life expectancy much lower than the life expectancy of other Canadians. Why should that be? Food insecurity much higher than that of other Canadians. And 50% of the Inuit the Inuit people have tuberculosis rates over 50% higher than the rest of us. Now that is a scandal. There's one thing that I don't know the right words to talk about it, but it's something I have learned sadly from my work at the Gathering Place. That is what I call the intersection of vulnerabilities. Some literature talks about multiple disorders, but it's not about disorders. It's about vulnerabilities. Any one person you will meet at the Gathering Place is either homeless or living in a dive downtown where they will maybe shot, but they'll certainly lose their paycheck if they're not there to get it. They've been abused, they're poor, they have a mental illness or they have physical illness, they probably just got out of jail. One person, the next person. I'm not talking about 1% of those 1,550 guests who pay $3 a year to be a member of the Gathering Place. I'm talking about 90% of those guests. Poor, mentally ill, physically ill, homeless, or poorly housed, abused, addicted, and probably in and out of jail. And you talking to me about taking personal responsibility for your health care. What chance on earth have they got of taking any personal responsibility for their health care? They're not going to the gathering place by choice for lunch. When they were 5 years old, they did not say, when I grow up, I hope I'm going to be poor enough and sick enough and abused enough to go to the gathering place for lunch. And that is not, sadly, that is not a unique problem. In this city, like, we're not that big a city, 1,550 guests choose to say, I want to pay $3 a year to come to the gathering place so I can get a hot meal for lunch, or I can get my breakfast, or I can get clothes free, or I can use your computers, or I can see my family doctor, or thank God soon I'll be able to see my dentist or see my barber. That's not in a city the size of Toronto or Montreal. Imprisonment, I haven't got time to talk about, but I think Debbie talked about the need to begin to address this in the schools, because what happens to you as a child just replicates itself into your adulthood. And we do not have any health system in this country that is able to deal with that complexity. Not one health system in Canada was created on this kind of definition of illness. Not one. And yet, if we don't respond to that, our health system is not good enough. And there's nothing we can do with the present system haphazardly or incrementally that's going to change it fast enough. And my final point is on the earth as a vulnerable one. Healthcare totally ignores the fact we have anything to do with the land or the sea or the air. We know today that a healthy human population is dependent on a healthy natural environment. And there are many who speak about intergenerational justice, said best by the Inuit. We do not inherit the land from our parents, we borrow it from our children. We do not have sustainable health in this country or in any country yet on earth. We humans, though, are making sure as fast as we can we're going to bring about global warming. That's going to have all kinds of effects across people. And who are going to be hit first? The poorest people. Then the rest of us. But the poorest people will be hit first. I want to give two quick examples from Newfoundland Labrador. Last year, if you remember, there was a panel on hydraulic fracturing on the west coast of this island. I was part of a group who went and spoke to that. One small group of health-related people in this province presented to that. One, not 10, not 50, but one. I said, how are you going to monitor the health effects of this? What system do we have? We can't even monitor boil water orders in this province. How are we going to monitor what happens if something goes wrong? And then how are you going to fix it? How are you going to address it? And one of the panelists later said publicly, what Sister said about health care was one of the things that made us decide to say no to hydraulic fracturing on the West Coast. Now, we learned a really good lesson from that, because now Muskrat Falls has all kinds of health implications. Nobody in healthcare is even looking at it. Nobody in this health system that I'm aware of is speaking to it or saying, what are the implications? We have nice consoling words saying, don't worry, if something happens, we'll fix it. So we in the health system, when I was burning Bunker C oil at St. Clair's in the 1980s, I didn't realize till I stood up with Dr. Ian Bomer in the parking lot and my white blouse turned black that I needed to do something about it. That's the last thing I remember in healthcare we did about environmental health. So we have much that we have to think through. We cannot incrementally save our health system. We cannot incrementally make it more fiscally responsible. We have to change our health system. We need that fourth transformation in my lifetime. We need to build a health system on that new definition of health from 1986. You have to be the leaders who create these circles of champions to bring about that transformation. And we have to find the most unlikely, most impossible, most aggressive partnerships possible to create the kind of health system that will be good enough for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Elizabeth. So, open the floor for questions. Karen?
Wonderful presentation. You raised a lot of issues and problems that people don't normally talk about when they talk about healthcare and healthcare reform. I guess my question has to do with your background and coming from a position of power. How are you able to accept transformation when it's so difficult for others? So going back to the idea of regionalization, I know that you played a role and you represented an institution, the church, which could have prevented transformation or change. But despite kind of that reality, you were able to accept this idea that transformation was inevitable and was within the public interest. So you being in the position of power at that time and influence, what are the conditions? What kinds of behavior, what kind of conditions are required in terms of shaping that transformative behavior, and what can we learn from your experience? I mean, regionalization, when we were looking at paradigm freeze, there are very few policy reforms which occurred within Newfoundland and Labrador, and even that was limited because we didn't have drugs or doctors who were being managed through regions. But I think the critical question around transformation or change is how do we focus on the problems or issues which there was a lack of power, or there was a lack of incentive in terms of addressing or recognizing or acknowledging these realities. Social disparity and disparity has increased over time, even though what we know about in terms of social determinants. So again, my question is, drawing upon your experience, drawing upon being in the position of influence or power, what are the lessons for others in order to recognize and understand that transformative actions begins by recognizing positions of power and influence and then transforming oneself?
I guess for me, Steve, there would be three things. First of all, nobody can do it alone. Now, I was smart enough to enter the convent so that I'd have people who'd support me if I got sick or if I got hungry or if I needed that kind of support. But we have to, none of us can do it alone. This room speaks to the fact you can bring together people with a common interest, but not necessarily like interests, to work together. The second thing is you have to see the faces of people who are suffering if you don't do it. I was in healthcare, acute care forever, until I saw the faces of the people at the gathering place. It never dawned on me that I couldn't deal with mental illness over here, physical illness over there, poverty over there, homelessness down there, because it's all in the same person. So when you see the faces of real people, when you see that young woman coming in with her 2-month-old baby, and you know where that 2-month-old baby's going to end up 22 years' time, then that gives you the passion for it, I think. But the third thing, and perhaps the most important thing of all, is that our healthcare system is so good that it would be a scandal not to make it better. That it is good for me. If I have a heart attack here right now, I'm going to be taken care of superbly. And I have sisters in Peru who don't have that benefit. Well, we do there because we can have enough money to pay for it. But 99% of the population there don't have it. So if we as Canadians know how valuable that healthcare system is, how much more important it is that it's the same for everybody. Not just, the healthcare system is a middle-class structure invented by middle-class leaders. That's what it is. We need to create a structure now that's good enough for, well, rich people can take care of themselves, for middle class and poorer people. And I think that's the three things. Do it together, never alone. Do it with a passion because it's real people, not a theoretical base. And know that we have a good system that could be so much a better system than it is. And keep talking about it 30 years, which is how long I'm at it.
Oh, we've got a question right over here in the front.
The one with the green.
Yes, sorry.
Sister Elizabeth, thank you very much for your presentation. It's brilliant as ever in all the talks that I've heard from you. because it shifts. It's not stuck in one place. It's not the same talk that you give each time. And that's really important. I wondered, given what we are talking about here in providing health to the most vulnerable in the population, what do you think about the two-tier system that has been discussed? And there seems to be some appetite for it here in the province. What are your thoughts on that? Is that going to relieve money for those who are poor and make it more accessible, or so that the rich pay and the poor have more? This is the argument that is made in its favor. But I wonder, where do you stand on it? Because I think universal health care is important, but people are thinking about how that could be fine-tuned.
I've thought a lot about that question for 30 years, and I've had the benefit of knowing Sisters of Mercy who provide health care all over the world. In the States, the Sisters of Mercy health systems own more hospitals than anybody else except the government there. We have Sisters of Mercy in Australia, in Ireland. They all have two-tier systems of one form or the other. I have no evidence from any of them that our system will be better if we went that way. The evidence I've ever read, and as many of you know, in its old iteration, I was the chair of CHSRF, any research we could gather at the time showed it would not achieve the ends that we wanted. So I have no evidence from practical research or from the sisters whom I know in these other countries which have such a system that it would be an improvement for our system to go in that direction. So I am not an advocate for a two-tier system as a result. I also know from those sisters that a two-tier system does not benefit the most vulnerable. It is, again, more a middle-class invention. It is not meant for the poorest of the poor or the most vulnerable of the vulnerable.
Okay, we had a question to my right first, and then if we have time, we'll get the next. In the back row. With the blazer. With no tie, sorry. I have no other way to describe. That's the one, thank you.
Sister, I would echo sentiments expressed earlier. A very lovely presentation. But I have to bring up a terrible subject. It's called money. And we all know, I think, in this room that we are, relative to our means, spending far more on healthcare now than the revenue base is there to support. And one of the takeaways that I have from today, and I'm not involved in the healthcare system in any way, I'm as good a layman by that definition as you can get. But the one takeaway that I can go home with is that I do not see any of the stakeholders in the healthcare profession willing to put much on the table in terms of how we might reduce expenditures on a system that we can ill afford. On top of that, we have to recognize the fact that what's coming down the road is going to be tough on the province, and we've got some real hard decisions to make. But again, I did not see today any serious, except those expressed by Dr. Parfrey perhaps, any serious effort to deal with those very real challenges. So you say that we actually have to make our system better, and indeed we do, and that we would agree that there's a lot of people left out of the system. But I would like you, if you would, to take a couple of minutes to kind of rise above all the stakeholder protectionism that we see constantly. How are we going to influence creative destruction in our healthcare system so that we can fundamentally make it better, so that it isn't a cliche?
Well, I have the benefit that you would not have had of having seen that happen right before my very eyes. I was a CEO of the first healthcare corporation, now Eastern Health, and we had no money. I'm sorry Dr. Williams is not here, but you can pass it on to him. They took money away from us and told us to amalgamate the system. I, at that point, had 7,000 staff in the organization and 600 physicians. I saw 7,600 people put themselves second. I brought together every union leader in this province and I said, how are you going to work with me to make this happen? They worked with me. We cut out 400 from this union, 200 from that union, 40% from management, and every single person in those 6 facilities that came together worked together in the mid-1990s to create a regional system in this province that was replicated nowhere else across the country. The Salvation Army paid a price, the Sisters of Mercy paid a price, the managers who got laid off paid a price. Most people paid a price, but they did it. And we did that. That's not hypothetical, that's not me standing, we can do this. We actually did it and the evidence is there. What I am saying here is that and I do think we're facing an even more dire situation. I don't think we can fix it by tinkering here and tinkering there. I think everybody, and you can see what I say there, not just the health system, not even just the social system, the business world, the academic world, we all have to come together and recognize we're in a crisis mode. We can't fix what we have because it's no good for those other people who are left out. So go back to the drawing board, create a new image of a health system that we can afford, but that does the good for all of us. If I hadn't done it once, I wouldn't think it was possible. Because I did it, and some people in this room walked with me on that journey, I know it is possible. But what does it require? Those leaders to create circles that are champions for this to happen. Pat's reference to some vague thing which he calls a healthcare accord is brilliant. How can we create a bringing together of diverse thinking, diverse minds with one thing in mind, a crisis is looming. We have the power to fix it if we work together. I know we can do it. As I said, I can't do it now. I'm too old and too frail and my mind is going. But we can do it because we did it before. We did it in the 1990s. Why can't we do it now? We have more money. You have more money in this province than you could dreamed of in 1994. We have superb technology capacity. We have way better educated people in the health system. We're better situated than we were way back then. If we did it then, we can do it now.
And we're out of time. Sorry. If you want to have a quick comment, we've got 1 minute. I'll set up the next presentation if that's okay. Okay, we've got to give him the microphone.
So, Sister, you're with that last comment, you're saying that we can restructure the healthcare system in the next 10 years.
Reimagine it first, then restructure it.
Right, but the reality is that you're saying is that we have to restructure society, and that we've got to decrease inequality, and we've got to...
No, Pat, I'm not. I knew you were going to ask that question. That's what makes leadership leadership. Like if we had taken a heads count in the 1990s and said to people, are you in favor of regional health structure that's going to close the Grace, move the Janeway? The answer would have been 90% no. But there were leaders at that time who said, we have to do something, so we can do it together. We're not going to change the number of people coming to the gathering place. In 30 years' time, we'll still need a gathering place. But I think that we can create something that is good, better than it is now, that is fiscally responsible, if we get the diverse views, though, in the same space, thinking together. And we don't have to wait for 10 years. This kind of, what I learned fast is the faster you put it out there baldly and boldly, the more quickly people recognize and move with it. I have incredible faith in the leaders in healthcare in this province and the leaders in social sector in this province. And I think we can do it. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't believe we're going to do it, because we absolutely have to do it. But it is a leadership question.
And we'll keep that as the final word from Sister Elizabeth. Thank you very much.